Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking, who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, today we have another educator. Here we have Glen with us. But Glen, before we get started, I need to know something very, very important. Are you prepared to engage?
I am prepared.
Let's do this. Let's go. So Glen Irvin has been in education around 20 years, and he currently works as an instructional coach in Sauk Rapids. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but it's in Minnesota. Glen has also previously been a Spanish teacher because he is well known by the Schoology community as a gamification expert, Schoology Ambassador, and he was the 2016 and 17 Schoology Educator of the Year. He is an avid gamer. He has a passion for gamification, playful learning, and game-based learning. So that's very, very exciting because he also, as a teacher, has had his classroom a gamified, quest-based mastery learning environment where the students were given the time and opportunity to, of course, what we all want, for the students to succeed. So Glen, welcome to today's episode.
Thank you so much for having me, man. It's awesome.
It's always crazy great to have also other fellow podcasters, and you didn't mention that. I haven't seen that in too many places, but I know you have a podcast as well, and it's called On Education. Is that right?
That is correct. Yep. And we're gonna get up to a year right now here in March.
Wow.
It will be our 1 year anniversary. Yes. And
that's a very exciting time.
Yeah, thank you.
Certainly. So Glen, we would like to get to know you a little bit better. So can you tell us, what does a regular day with Glen look like?
Now that I'm an instructional coach, it's actually really different than it was as far as teaching. And I would say different because in a teaching schedule, it was very... everything was dictated to me. So we had a bell schedule. You knew exactly what you were going to be doing each day. You were structuring your classes, preparing things for your classes, grading, etc. And it felt really structured to me. And now that I'm an instructional coach, I have more freedom to work on a variety of things, but I also have that constant, what I call the constant disruption of when things go wrong. I'm out there because I do tech integration also. So we're out solving problems, whether they actually be tech issues themselves or they actually be teachers that need help implementing a lesson, and sometimes on the fly. So it might be like, hey, I need you like today. So I might have to just get out of my office and then go into a classroom and help students and teachers with whatever it might be, whether it be some software, an app, or something else that they need help with. So that part of the job is interesting because I've never had anything like that where you were constantly interrupted, as far as the flow. And I also never had this much freedom, which is also really awesome. I really am enjoying it. It's now been a little bit over a year that I've been at Sauk Rapids. So it's pretty exciting.
Fantastic. That's very, very exciting. So I'm guessing that you're also putting that little vein of gamification into some of the teachers you work with, right?
Absolutely. That was my first thing to get the word out that I would be willing to help with gamification and game-based learning. I also love Minecraft. So that's one of the first things that we actually received the scholarship, kind of an internal scholarship in the school to purchase 100 licenses K through 12 so that we could go ahead and kind of introduce the concept to people so that they would get used to it. So hopefully that the district continues to purchase the licenses from this point forward, really into Minecraft in a variety of content areas. So, and it sounds like a lot of my fellow teachers here in the district are excited to get started with it too.
That sounds absolutely great. So Glen, now that we know you've been going on for quite some time with not only education, but also with gamification, now you're also an instructional coach. we want to know of a time, of course, because we all know now that it's not just rainbows and unicorns.
That's true.
Things do go wrong.
Yes.
And we test things, we try things, and we improve. That's part of our job. That's part of what we do every now and then, every time that we can. So we want to know of one of those times that it didn't go right, that you didn't go how you expected it, that this happened, this perfect storm or whatever, and you had this fail moment, this first attempt in learning. Can you describe us, take us to the ground level, see what happened, what went wrong, and of course, how you got out of it because you're still here today?
Awesome. I would say one of the things that I talk to teachers about when we're talking about gamification, as far as all of the different types of elements, and I always tell teachers, number one, you don't have to do everything that I did, because I did it because I was passionate about each of these aspects of gamification and implementing it into my classroom. But one of the things that I tell teachers that was a fail moment for me was had to do with leaderboards. I had read about them and really wanted to implement them into my classes. And I did do that. So I had these leaderboards that were both individual leaderboards and then kind of team guild leaderboards that accounted for XP, which was their points that they had been earning in class. And I found that it was actually working against the engagement of some of my students. Some of my students that would get far enough behind would see themselves on the leaderboard at the bottom of the leaderboard and actually would have the exact opposite purpose that I wanted the leaderboard to be something so that they would be engaged with it and excited and want to go ahead and climb to the top of the leaderboard. And instead, it made them disinterested and wanting to just quit, which would be associated with a bad game. If you feel like you're never going to be able to climb out of the hole of a game, you just set it down and say, I'm not going to play that because I don't like it. And so my class became unplayable for some of my students. And so I had to adjust that. And during one of the middle of one of my years, I actually scrapped the individual leaderboard and then did some things with the guilds, the teams themselves, so that they could see themselves within a team, and then being able to use that same concept, but use it as a motivator instead of something that would be, the exact opposite, which would be a detractor from even wanting to participate, which I didn't know that would happen. And I tell teachers, I'm not saying that this is going to happen to you, but it did definitely happen to me. And maybe there was ways to be able to, prevent that from happening in a different way. But for sure, individual leaderboards, I found that it didn't work for me.
Yeah, when people talk about bad gamification, it's typical to hear about points, badges, and leaderboards, which are not bad every single time.
Yes. And I mean, as far as badges, you're exactly right, too, on that aspect, that I was lucky enough to have been coached by some awesome gamification experts that told me about proper ways to use badges, basically as achievements, to be able to show that you've actually attained more of micro-credentialing, where you show that I actually have a specific skill and I just demonstrated it. So now I've achieved this specific badge. So it's more, I would say, towards the achievement or micro-credentialing versus just giving out stickers, the stickerification of education, that type of stuff where it doesn't work well at all.
Yeah, and they have to be meaningful. That's what I always say when mentioning these things, especially because they have to be meaningful. And with leaderboards, again, I've seen leaderboards being applied usefully, but I'm not sure if I've seen them outside of like sales teams be applied individually with success. So yes, leaderboards, there's ways to apply them, and it's natural that we try them and see them. We've seen the whole any game that is like online and those kinds of things. You have a leaderboard. There's many different ways in which they show them. But of course, once they get there and they see a certain thing and they're within the classroom, they can see each other's faces and they say, I'm not ever going to catch John, who is at the top. They feel discouraged.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's exactly what was occurring too. And it was a good lesson learned too, that not everything that I heard that was out there is really going to be applicable to my classroom.
Absolutely. And it's a great lesson learned, Glenn. Now let's move on to something a lot more cheerful. And it's of one of those times when you set out to do something. You had this big challenge in the classroom that you had, or for a full year, or for a specific lesson, for a specific class, whatever you want to talk about. You had this very big challenge, and you solved it using game-based learning, playful education, gamification, whatever it is that you used as a tool to solve that engagement problem or that problem that you had. Can you guide us through that story, Glenn?
Sure. So I would say that my biggest success that I ever had in my classrooms was actually a humongous risk that I took, I think, because I didn't know if it was going to work. So those are the scariest moments when you're like, and it was not a one-time thing. It was going to be something that I was going to try for a whole 9-week period, so a quarter in our system here in Minnesota. So it was a whole grading period, and it was a upper-level Spanish class. And I really wanted them wanted all of us to pull away from textbook curriculum, from vocab lists and dictated grammar stuff, and really try to immerse them completely in an environment where they would be not only asked but compelled to go ahead and speak in the Spanish language, and they would have a desire to want to go ahead and want to learn more and more. And so I felt like, okay, if I create a game-based learning environment all within Minecraft, and I have my students basically in a 9-week period, we all live in this world. And I called it El Mundo de Leyendas, which is like the world of legends. And each week was a specific, had specific quests that the students had to participate in. And if you can imagine this, people are like, how did you do this as far as technically? Well, we didn't have high tech very much. We had a computer lab, and I had my 20-some students all in the computer lab. And the rule was, as soon as you stepped into the computer lab classroom, which I checked out the whole entire 9 weeks, which was very popular in my school. But anyway, we would go in there, and we would all basically, the biggest thing was I told them, we had to role play. As soon as we are in here, we're no longer, Glen Irvin, and you're no longer you, but we're these other people, and we're going to immerse ourselves in this environment, and also make sure that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to only speak in the Spanish language. So each week was a set of quests within the game. So it was totally game-based learning. We're doing these adventures inside of the game, and I set up a bunch of kind of adventure/quests inside the game, where it's challenging the students to have to work together to solve problems, and the problems and everything was based again in the Spanish language. There was characters, NPCs inside of the game that would set up some of the quests. So it was kind of felt like totally role-playing Final Fantasy or Skyrim or those kinds of things. That's kind of what I was kind of going for, is you'd come to a person and they would give you a problem that they would have. The students would discuss the problem as classmates in a class or as a guild, as a group, and then try to come up with some solutions. And sometimes the things were, I need you to gather something for me, etc., and whatever might be. And there would be a challenge to be able to get that specific item. Or sometimes it would be like in real video games where you'd have to go defeat the chupacabra or something else like that, where you'd have to work together to be able to do something. And so the 9 weeks flew by, and we, as a way to keep track of what we were actually learning, we had to fill out these reflections at the end of each day, which were actually the homework assignments. So they were done outside of class. And then in class, we just spoke Spanish, and we accumulated basically I don't want to call it a dictionary because that's too ugly of a term. It was more of an accumulation of like terms that we needed to know to be able to communicate with each other. So students didn't go like, I'm going to learn the future tense and I'm going to keep using the future tense just for this week. That's kind of a dictated curriculum where you're like, the next 2 weeks, we're going to learn the future and the conditional. That's all we're going to speak. It's like, that's not real in real life. More in real life is I need to be able to ask my partners, these specific set of questions and know like a variety of answers to be able to respond to them. So we were building the curriculum as we went along, which if you went to Venezuela or you went to Spain or Mexico, wherever you went to, you would find the things that you needed to know at the moment and then you learn those things, and you would keep accumulating knowledge that way. It would be more natural, basically. I wanted it to be more of a natural learning process. And in the end, my students, I assessed them with tests that I had used previously, which is crazy. So I didn't teach specific curriculum, but I assessed with some speaking assessments, some other types of assessments, including writing, and then some reading also. And they scored crazy awesome. They were way above my previous classes that I had ever taught. And I attributed the whole entire thing to them being excited about coming into class each day, and then also knowing that it was going to be an adventure versus it being kind of another typical day in class. And at the end of the 9 weeks, their feedback was also amazing. And they gave me feedback along the way each week too about the game, like things that they found, hey, maybe we need to add some more of these types of elements. So they knew games too, and they found things that were wrong with the game elements of the game that the next week we could adjust and then fix and then be able to add to those quests and adventures and those kinds of things. So the game was being also, they had ownership also in the game itself. So that was super cool too.
There's so many things that I could pull out from all the things you said there. But listeners, engagers, if you're listening to this and you want to go back and listen to it again, because there's so many things. Again, there's a great use of the game. There's use of all these elements, of these social interaction elements, the immersion. There's so many things within this story that I would actually recommend you to go back. I think it's like 8 minutes or something, and listen to the story again. Just try to pull down and write down all the elements that you find, and we can have a chat about it for sure. You can just shoot me an email and we'll talk about it for sure. So yes. Glenn, is there any, like, if I told you there's one thing that you would like to bring up as a major learning that you had from that experience, what would you say that learning is?
The biggest learning thing is that I planned everything ahead for the whole 9 weeks. And that was actually a mistake. I should have had because I stressed myself out basically too much about it. I needed to just have a framework of where we were headed and what were my objectives. Because actually all my quests were hidden elements of what I wanted them to learn as far as the Spanish language. So I didn't just set up the things just randomly. I wanted them to be able to do specific types of things in the language. So speak in the past tense, be able to ask a variety of these certain types of questions. And so I just needed a framework and kind of a guide of how we were going to be headed. And then I should have right away known that I needed to include my students in the way that the game was going to head. Because when students have ownership in that, then they're like, okay, this is the end of this week, but here's some feedback about kind of what more things we would like to see next week, these types of things. And you can then adjust over the weekend, boom, boom, put that together, and then have that next week ready to go. And the other thing that it also reminded me of is that each class is unique. When I tried this again the following year, I made sure that I let that specific group of students, their chemistry, their ideas, bring out those things in the game. So the game wasn't always just set and created. It was kind of being driven by those students' voice. That's so important. And I didn't realize that at that moment, how important that was going to be. But as I went on, I was like, oh, this is the really important aspect of all of this, is that they get to participate and reflect in the building of this adventure.
It is, and it's very, very important whenever it is that it's possible for you to incorporate such a feedback, and it's phenomenal. And Glenn, now that we're talking about this, and this is a question we always make because we're curious about how do you do these things, and especially now that you're an instructional coach. Imagine that tomorrow you're going to either be, again, a teacher of a new class that you're going to teach, or that somebody comes up and says, look, I want to do this thing for gamification in my class, or this game-based learning. What are the steps? What's the process, if there's such a process that you would follow? What are the things that you would do to help this person, or even for yourself, for a new curriculum that you're building? How would you build this whole thing from the ground up?
I said the first thing, I always tell teachers that no matter what you're using as far as any type of tool or any type of technique, that you really need to make sure you truly understand what is it that you want your students to come out with at the end. So what are the true can-do, I call them the can-do statements, the objectives, the standard, whatever it might be, but really break it down to say, my students need to know these things. I mean, not just some highly worded standard, but really say, hey, I want them to know these 5 things by this thing, and this is, and then start making a plan. Okay, how do we actually get there? Now, if you're going to use game-based learning, like the way that I did as far as those things, you really have to be kind of, I think, invested in that. So you have to be passionate about it. So you have to kind of play the game too, and be into and know kind of the mechanics of it and kind of what you can manipulate in the game. Because I knew I could manipulate, for example, these little NPC characters. I was like, okay, this can lead me in a direction and help me out with this. And I knew the mechanics, some other game type of mechanics where I could set up quests and tasks that would be that would have to involve problem solving. So whatever you decide to go ahead and use, you want it to be kind of this people talk about problem-based learning or project-based learning. Well, you have to set up things that are meaningful for the students. That's something that actually says, oh, there's something here. How do I solve this? Whatever it might be. So those are some important aspects. And I would just say, number one, play the game, get some, like I just said, the can-do statements. And I would say then talk to your students about what are they into also, because if you're the only one really into this, that's not a good thing. So you have to really know like where are they coming from and what are their passions. Tap into those specific things and then base whatever you create on what it feels like they're into that year. Because each year, each set of new students, all of our teachers know this, they come in with a completely new set of things. They're similar in a way, but they have these new patches, new things come up, new things that they're really into. And then even within the groups themselves, they have individual things that they're super into. Try to find ways to incorporate those aspects into the game. And I would say I did this in a summer before, and I started laying all this out. And I wasn't alone either. And that's the other thing you have to realize in this community, social media communities that exist now. You can go onto Twitter, and you should, and find yourself like the Games for Ed hashtag or the Minecraft EDU hashtag, and reach out to people that are on there on a consistent basis and reach out for their expertise. And man, I found so many people were willing to go through my stuff and go, hey, Glenn, I wouldn't do these things, or I would use this instead of this thing. Oh, it was so awesome. And they were right. I mean, they really gave me some great feedback, and it gave me the ability to go in there with confidence to be able to go ahead and implement these lessons.
That's phenomenal. Thank you very much for letting us into all those sort of, secrets of the trade in a way of how you do your classes.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, the biggest thing is that, and as far as that social media component, is that everybody's so willing to go ahead and share those trade secrets and say, hey, here's something that I did. You might want to try this, or here's a research article about this specific topic. Read that and then see what you can incorporate out of that into your classes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So Glenn, we always go into the second part with like a sort of a different vibe, because we were very much into stories, knowing how your day was, and now we want to know perhaps the things that are a bit more specific in a sense. And the first one is we've been talking about your process. But is there something that you would say, well, you're going to go into a gamification, a game-based learning project? Would you say that there is something that you could call a best practice, or something that if you think about this thing, it would be always benefiting these types of projects?
Yeah, so I would say the most important part of entering any of these or using any of these aspects of gamification or game-based learning is that you become knowledgeable in them, and that you get other people's examples and have them sitting in front of you and know how they work for other people. Not that you're going to copy them. You could use some of the things that worked for them, but you want to understand it completely of how it worked for them, whether you're reading a book or you're reading some articles, or you're asking them direct questions. For example, like I said, on social media, whatever it might be, that you say, okay, here's what I'm getting out of this, and really have a clear idea about what are the elements that you're going to use, and then being able to put those then together, and then really kind of think through how is this going to work for the whole year? So when I talk to other teachers about this, I tell them, if you're going to use gamification elements in your classroom, make sure that you can do this for the whole entire year. Like you can, or for the entire period that you're planning on doing it, for the 9 weeks or whatever it might be, that it won't become such a burden on you that you can't actually make it work. You can't keep up the, we talk about formative feedback. You can't keep up the feedback. And if you can't keep up that feedback loop and keep the students engaged in the game, they will forget about the game, and it will become something kind of like annoying on the side, instead of it's something where it's the center of all the engagement, of all the passion of your students. You're like, we're really into this. So making sure that you can, whatever you do implement, that you can go ahead and handle it yourself. So don't bite off more than you can chew, that kind of adage. I would say that was the biggest thing for me too, because I tried to do everything all at once, and I definitely felt overwhelmed at moments. But the biggest thing that I could see in my students is they wanted that feedback. They wanted to know how they were growing, both in the Spanish language, but also in this game itself that we had set up. So those were super important aspects. And I think that that's the kind of the biggest turnoff for teachers sometimes, is that they bite off more than they can chew, and then they become overwhelmed. The game becomes stale in their classroom, and then it dies. The game and then they're like, well, gamification or game-based learning, it didn't work, and that's because I think sometimes we just take on too much, or we don't know enough about something, and then we end up going like, okay, it failed. I don't want to do this anymore.
Always afraid of failing, that's for sure. But we have to.
Totally.
I think that as educators and as human beings in general, we have to shake off a bit that fear and try to go into things with that scientific sort of mindset and say, well, this didn't work. Let me check out and see what else or what's similar. What can I tweak? What can I change to make this work?
Absolutely. Yes.
So Glenn, what would you say is your favorite game?
My favorite game of all time? I rate them on different levels, because I become passionate about like certain things at certain times. Like, okay, currently I'm super into a game called Farm Together. It seems really weird. It's like a Farmville heyday kind of game. Those games that used to exist, or that they probably still do, on apps for phones. But now there's a PC and a console version of a game called Farm Together. And the coolest part is that you can get all of your friends, and it encourages you to get all of your friends onto your farm and kind of build it up. You also build up your individual character itself. And it is more, I like kind of grind kind of games. So that's the reason why I think I really am into this game currently. But as far as if you would have asked me last year about this exact same question, I would say there was a game called Monster Hunter World. And again, it's another game where I'm really into games where you have to invest a lot of time and effort into to be able to grow your characters. And that's Monster Hunter World. It's a total grind game where you're fighting against all of these different types of prehistoric monsters, and also fantasy types of things that someone has created. And you build up your character in a variety of different fighting styles and whatever it might be. And so that's a super awesome game for me. But as far as all-time legendary types of games, the first game that I ever played that I was super into, and I can still play it pretty well, I still would consider myself to be a top 5%er, is a game called Galaga. I don't know if you ever played that game.
It sounds familiar, but I can't remember. I can't like find it somewhere.
Galaga is one of the original games. Came along with like Miss Pac-Man, those kinds of games, Pac-Man kind of games. And the reason, I mean, it's super simplistic. You're shooting these little things up at the top, and the reason why I really enjoyed it after a while is because for one quarter I could play for basically an hour. and that was unheard of when in the days when you actually had to put in a quarter. I would last consistently at least an hour, if not longer. So that was my claim to fame, is that I could go through many, many, many levels of Galaga and make my hand hurt very much as I blasted my way through many levels there. So that's one of my all-time favorite games. I still have a lot of memorabilia about Galaga because one day maybe I'll even have the game itself. We'll see.
I'm sure it's on Steam or something.
Oh yeah, it totally is. Yes.
So is there somebody, when you hear these questions and you hear all the things that we've been talking about, is there somebody that comes to your mind that you would say, well, this person would be a great guest for this type of interview in Professor Game?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I know so many people that would fit this mold. People that have basically mentored me, and I wouldn't be anywhere. I wouldn't have been able to do the things that I did without them. The first one I would mention, his name is Chris Haskell, Dr. Haskell, and he's at Boise State University. And I actually took a course from him that was called Teaching and Learning in Virtual Worlds. And that was the course that got me into this whole Minecraft thing. He pushed me to go beyond kind of some, I would call it kind of some cheesy use of a game like Minecraft in class, kind of like some using it as a poster, as a 3D maker, and really push it to game-based learning. So Dr. Chris Haskell would be an amazing guest, and maybe you've already had him, and he is so awesome.
No, he hasn't been a guest.
Oh, you got to have him on. He's amazing, and he's not only an amazing, gamification, game-based learning professor, but he's just an awesome person to talk to. Talk about stories. You got to ask him about stories. He tells some amazing stories. There's another gentleman. He's in Toronto. His name is Paul Darvasi. I don't know if you've ever had Paul.
Somebody already just suggested him. I think it was last week's. It could have been Stephen Isaacs.
Yes. Oh, yeah, totally. Yes. You got to get Paul Darvasi on here. He is the guy that I go to whenever I want to do alternate reality games in class, or I want to talk to or connect with him with somebody. And he's done some amazing things in class where he basically turned his class into novels that they were reading. And you see some of his stuff online. He blogs about all of these things, about how he went about doing it, how you can go ahead and do it, too. And I think it's called Ludic Learning is his blog posts. But Paul Darvasi, he's an amazing person. Along the same lines of alternate reality games is John Fallon. And he's a teacher in Connecticut. And he is also an amazing, he's done game-based learning, some alternate reality games with his students. And again, and even Paul and him have combined to have these crazy games that are going on. One based in Toronto, one in Connecticut, where they're competing against each other and kind of mysteriously connected to these two classrooms in this alternate reality world. So you'll have to. He also blogs. John Fallon does, and has a great following and amazing detailed articles about how he went about doing the things that he's doing as far as in his classrooms. So those are three that I would say.
That sounds fantastic.
For sure. Yes, that you would for sure want to have on, and they are all amazing people and have great stories.
And in that same sense, you have mentioned that some of them have also blogs, and you mentioned books as well. If you had to recommend one book to our listeners, to the engagers, what book would you recommend and why?
Oh, God. That's a hard question. I would say if you don't know much about gamification, you just jumped onto this podcast and you're like, oh, okay, this sounds interesting. I really want to know kind of some basics, just kind of get into some things. I would pick up the Teach Like a Pirate or series. I think that's what it's called. And he goes through and explains kind of some simple gamification methods that have worked at kind of an elementary school, but I think they could work on a variety of different things. And the book itself is super easy to read, very well done. The other book that I would highly recommend reading is by Matt Farber, and I think it's just called Gamify Your Classroom. And Yes, yeah, I think that's what it's called. And the reason why I really like that book, and I hand it to teachers all the time, is because you can just open it up to any of the chapters. Like go right to the middle of the book and find a technique that's working for a specific teacher, and then also the resources that go along with that specific type of technique, whether it was game-based learning or gamification, alternate reality games, you name it, you'll find it inside of this book. And he does a really good job of kind of big span of scope of all kinds of different type of methods, and then also providing the resources for a teacher to be able to kind of delve further into those things.
That's fantastic. I'm sure that's a great book. Matt was actually one of the ones that mentioned you in previous episodes, and that's how we got in contact. But his book is definitely on my list. I've heard it several times recommended by different people, so it has to be a great book as well, I'm sure.
Yes, and talking about Matt, of course, that's great that you already interviewed him because he's a fantastic guest also too. Yes, he's an amazing person, also a big mentor of mine, and just anything that he writes, I read it, whether it's his blog post articles or his books, because he's just an amazing resource of knowledge.
Absolutely. But now, Glenn, I would like to know, what is your superpower, your sweet spot when designing these types of things? When you're helping a professor and you find a case, you say, this is exactly the thing that I specialize in, the best thing that I do. What would that kind of thing be?
For myself, I guess my biggest, I would say my superpower is I can really look into students' eyes, and not even just my students, but now that I teach adults, and look into their eyes and then be able to tell whether or not they're into whatever you're doing. And that's a super important thing I think a lot of teachers miss out on is really looking at your audience and being able to tell whether or not they are really engaged in what you're doing and how you're presenting it, and then making adjustments from that point, so not just grinding through things and just going like, well, we're going to do it no matter what, but really looking into them and then being able to adjust to those things too. So I guess that would be my big superpower is that I look at my students and I go, okay, I can tell you're not really, most of you are not into what's happening here. I need to make an adjustment because what we're doing here as far as teaching and learning and all this stuff is so important. I want to make sure that you get it, that you're really into it, passionate. So, we need to make a U-turn of whatever it might be, or at that moment, we need to kind of take a little bit of a break and then come back to it because we need a restart, as far as getting back into whatever the materials are. So I think that that's such an important skill of teaching. And if I was going to teach new teachers, it's coming into the profession, I would tell them, make sure you are engaging with your audience. You really understand on their end what they're, kind of what are they feeling out there, and then you make adjustments for kind of as you go along in your lessons. So you don't just grind through stuff because you have to. That's the worst thing I think ever is you got to make sure you make adjustments for who they are, and then incorporate those things that really caught them, really grasp them. For me, it was things like I play a guitar and I sing. So those types of things, like starting off a class by singing a song together and, playing guitar and kind of having fun, those types of engagers, really important to kind of getting the energy up in your class so that you can continue that energy throughout however long time you have together to learn everything that you can. And I always told them, I was telling my student, I was really honest about this. I said, we have such a short time together. Let's make sure that we can learn everything that we possibly can, as far as within this time that we have together. And then for my thing, it was just basically learning as much Spanish as you possibly could, in this limited amount of time that we have together.
Absolutely. So Glenn, we're almost running out of time by now. So I would like to know if you have any quick final piece of advice for our listeners. Then let us know how we can find you, where we can find you, and then we'll say it's game over.
Okay. So I would say biggest piece of advice is to, just like I said earlier, to understand and know that you're not alone out there. And on that note, if you follow me at Irv Spanish, IRV Spanish on Twitter, and you want to grow your professional learning network, just let me know. I will connect you with a whole bunch of other people on Twitter in a variety of grade levels and content areas that are all passionate about basically connecting educators to whatever they are passionate about. So if it is gamification or game-based learning, man, there's a whole network out there of people that are not only just a connection, someone you follow on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's someone that you can eventually, when you meet these people that I've just talked about in real life, they are your friends. They will help you with whatever they can because they are super passionate about education and learning itself and our students. So they will help you. So I would say that's the biggest piece of advice: is get out there and connect with as many people as you can, and then ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask. There is no dumb question, and we can definitely get you in connection with the right people or the right resources, and then get you started on this journey, which is just so awesome and has really invigorated my career when I really incorporated these elements into it. So at Irv Spanish, and then I have an email address that you're more than welcome to. It's just my name, glenirvin@gmail.com too, that you can go ahead and reach out to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for all those communication channels, all that great advice that you've given us today, all the time that you've invested today, Glenn, because I know teachers and instructional coaches like yourself have a lot on their plate, and you also have a family and personal life to attend to. You have your podcast, so many things going on, so many exciting things going on as well. So I really want to thank you for your time. However, it's time by now to say it's game over.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Hey, Engagers. Thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. How are you listening to this podcast? If you're using any podcasting app, have you subscribed and rated this podcast? Please do so. That way we can reach more Engagers like you to achieve our mission of making learning amazing. And if you want the instructions, you can go to professorgame.com/iTunes. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know how to use the psychology of games through the expert Jamie Madigan? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.